Well, good morning again. Here to really just discuss a bit of the history of our two industries, which is Scotch whisky and Irish whisky, and really the similarities and the connections between the two. If you could start off.
Sure, and I suppose there are an enormous amount of commonalities, and that goes back quite a long time. And one way I've always thought about it, again, a lot of branding is very keen to keep distinctions because they're USPs. It's keen to this is what Irish whiskey is, and this is what Scotch whiskey is, and a lot of that stuff can be quite constraining. But it also is not really reflective of history in the first place. That they are, you look at, say, a lot of people now in food talk about foodways. Instead, we've kind of moved away from national cuisines and started saying, well, the food in the northwest of Italy doesn't look all that different to the food in Nice, and these things kind of flow, and certainly, whiskey is in its roots a foodway, and it went up the belt from again across Ireland and Scotland, and it's not that odd that there should be so much running exchange thereafter. And so, certainly from the records early enough, I remember seeing a lot of stuff about herrings and aquavita being sold between the Inner Islesmen and the north coast of Ireland in Ulster. Certain Elizabethan authorities refer to this kind of trade, where you're looking at an agricultural folk commodity. Of course, it's mixed up in this this back and forth. You start seeing these strange, again at the very, very early roots. A lot of kind of my research was in Gaelic medical manuscripts, and a lot of those that you find in Ireland and Scotland, like the Beaten Lilium is the exact same text as identical Liliums that occur in Ireland, because they're part of this kind of shared kind of cultural sphere where this knowledge goes back and forth. And that kind of more organic, more kind of ribosomic history is often replaced with very easy to tell, well, who invented it first, and then what happened, and then what happened. And that's not what history looks like. History looks like a bunch of balls of paint thrown at a wall, and well, this happened and this happened over here, and then someone else learned about aquavita independently from them, and that was this, and so forth. And that's much richer, I think. And it continues, certainly in kind of folk poetry, you see the idea of ushkabah, of ishkabaha, as we would say, but it is just a thing. It is just a drink, and it belongs to itself, and it's only later as you start getting interests that you start hearing about Irish and Scotch whiskey, and that takes a long while to occur. It's only really in terms of businesses, it starts with the rise of commercial distilleries in the 1700s, and then in terms of hard distinctions, it's only really in the 20th century, early 20th century, that this stuff was cracked down on. You see a lot of whiskey made, as we mentioned in the Alfred Barnard book, made to a style and then sold as such. And Cameron Bridge do a distillation of mixed mash in a pot still and say, oh, that's our Irish whiskey. This kind of Wild West has disappeared with legislation, but they've always been intertwined. There's always been back and forth. You look at people coming. There's a long history of co-ownership. I mean, you look at the Jemiesons. The Jemiesons were not only Scottish; they were, relatives of the Steens and the Haigs. They were intermarried into both families. So deeply interlinked. And again, conversely, you get, Robert Steen's device, the proto-patent, and then Aeneas Coffey shortly thereafter, and you have the Jemiesons, who are related to those Steens, opposing the column still. Aeneas Coffey coming in up here and basically within a matter of 2 decades outselling Steen's device rather quickly. Now, of course, they were both copying the French in reality, but you get that idea of this exchange of ideas that's gone back and forth. Even after the kind of folk history of whiskey, even when it becomes an industrial history, and then you start seeing in the late Victorian era these kinds of shared companies emerging. You start seeing people who have interests on both sides, and that starts to become a thing, which to this day, I mean, Pernod Ricard owned Jameson itself, and then they own Aberlour and Chivas, all these various companies transcend these borders. So it has never been clear cut, and it has always gone back and forth. Bladnoch was owned by a man from Belfast at one point, at 2 points actually.
I always find it one of the peculiarities of the whisky industry is that our products outlast the companies. Normally, it's the other way around. Companies outlast their products. There's always product innovation, but Haig and Johnny Walker, these are names that go way back, and the companies have changed, but the owners have changed, but the brands haven't. Well, one thing that's been very much driven in Scotland is legislation. We've gone down that route of putting, really from the 1900s, putting in definitions and legal definitions for that, and that's in the SWA are very active today trying to get those definitions into different countries' laws to protect Scotch whisky from counterfeiters, etc. But also it's driven by reciprocals, trading between companies, so they ensure that the whisky is of a standard, made to a standard that so once liquids mix together, you can't separate them out. Is that a way? Do you see Ireland going down that route? There are advantages and disadvantages. Can Ireland take the advantages and discard the disadvantages, as it were?
Yeah, well, I suppose my thing on the differences between Irish and Scottish whisky are only largely developed in the last 100 years in real sense. A lot of the things, like the more recent ideas that Irish whisky is triple distilled is largely just because with the collapse of Irish whisky, it was left with only the triple distilling distilleries. There was plenty of examples of double distilled before, and there will be plenty more, and vice versa with Scotland. And I suppose the big thing was political, in that we lost our trade with the Empire and probably paid more respect to American prohibition than our Scots the Scots did, and so the industries kind of diverged at that point. But it's not. We have the similar climates and similar resources as far as grains, and a lot of shared knowledge. Some of the most successful guys in the Irish whisky sphere over the years have come from Scotland, and vice versa. So there's a lot of shared knowledge, and particularly now in this modern day. But that is one of the big things that I would have as a concern for Irish whisky, and I've been trying to make that point where I can to guys. There's in the last 10 years there's been a re-emergence. There's now approaching 50 distilleries where there was only 4 a decade ago and on the island, and a lot of the stuff I hear in explanations from distilleries as to why they're going to be successful, the quotes about the rate of growth in Irish whisky being 20% per annum for over 20 years, but that's largely Jameson sales. It's not small individual craft distilleries that are growing at 20% per annum. And there's also the reference to, well, is there going to be too many? Oh, it's like, oh sure, Scotland has over 100 distilleries. There's obviously space for 50 in Ireland, but I think there's a misunderstanding of how those distilleries operate in Scotland. Many of the new distilleries in Ireland have spent tens of millions of euros on equipment that they can only afford to run a couple of batches a week, or maybe 5 production days a week, and leave the distillery lie idle for 16 hours a day and idle for maybe the weekend. And that's not making best use of your resource. The Scottish model, to be more, even with the really famous malt house, the single malt distilleries that they sell a lot of their excess, I suppose, into blends, and that helps them to be more sustainable and make more use of their asset and their skill set, and be more protected against what is okay at the moment. Irish whiskey is very in vogue, and new distilleries are finding it very easy to sell even their young spirits. But what happens if something changes and rum becomes cool and Irish whiskey isn't as cool for 5-10 years or longer, and then all of a sudden you're not as protected? And so I've been trying to work with some distilleries and at the moment of maybe because there's a lot of sense of cooperation in the Irish industry. It's not that everyone is alienating themselves from everywhere else. It's just this, I suppose, idea that we can do it completely on my own is a bit foolhardy. I think so. I think if that Scotch whisky approach is more taken, where, like you said, there's trading between distilleries and working with big blenders, I think it has a far better chance at becoming a more sustainable product, because the quality of the liquid is very good. The problem for small distilleries is you just can't get the meetings with buyers. Maybe you can't get your product as widely distributed as the big multinationals are. You're not going to have the same opportunity there. Whereas on a smaller level, and where people that maybe like ourselves that are really interested in whiskey will find that boutique or craft distillery or small distillery and source them out because they do this special distillation method or this special mash bill. It's just it's a slow burner, and it will build, and I think it's a bit foolish maybe to only go, oh, well, we only need to use the distillery 3 or 4 times a week now because we're only going to be able to sell this. You still have bought the distillery. You may as well make a little bit more use of your time. So that would be my opinion.
I didn't realise that most Scotch whisky distilleries are pushed. The challenge within a lot of Scotch whisky distilleries is how do you keep up that high production but keep up the high quality of flavour at the same time, and that's really the real challenge. And so we've seen expansions of distilleries. I know a lot of new distilleries have been built, but we forget about that. Quite some number of the famous distilleries have put on half as much again in capacity, putting in new stills, putting in new kits, and the challenge therefore is how do you get the same quality of liquid coming out?
Well, that's where, by volume, that's where the biggest growth has been. There's 2 to 3, or 1 major distillery and 2 others probably that have grown in volume larger than all of the other 50 put together. So it's maybe not. You're talking about LPAs or litres of whiskey produced there. That's yeah, and how do they, and that has been part of the challenge as well, particularly for the more established brands. You become incredibly successful with your 15-year-old whiskey, and it far outpaces where you thought you were going to be, your growth was going to be. What happens with that product? Do you just make it more expensive to try and, or which maybe alienate certain customers, or do you start to compromise, or if it's whether or not that growth, unfortunately, one of the unfortunate elements to our industry is that sometimes your growth happens before you're ready to exploit it. And there's always
growth too fast.
It's
almost as bad as no growth at all.
There's worse problems. That you don't want to become a victim of your own success, in the sense that your products become so successful that you end up having to compromise on things that probably erodes what made you successful in the first place.
As I understand it, in Ireland, there's a dearth of aged stock because of the growth problem. So there's not enough 12-year-old or 10-year-old, which the consumer is now expecting as almost a standard age. When we were talking about some of the older whiskies, more historical whiskies, a 5-year-old would be quite an old whiskey.
There is an element of age statement isn't always everything, but at the same time, given like I said, 50 new distilleries have started within the last 10 years. The vast majority of the liquid available on the island is less than 5 years old. There's very little stock that was being held aside because 10 years ago, or longer, 20 years ago, nobody was really interested in really aged stock, so they didn't really tend to build up this reserve. And then when the success came in the last decade, a lot of people capitalised on it by selling a lot of that old stock. So it's eroded away very quickly.
It was just now, it just struck me just now. One thing Scotland's got is loads of aged stock. We've got lots of aged whiskies. Yet there's never any move to have an Irish Scotch blend. Is that regulation? Because you can't, because there's labelling problems with that. What would you call it?
So you could call it generic whiskey, but you couldn't call it Scotch or Irish. And it's odd because I think the previous conversation we were talking about the kind of blur, and when DCL absorbed a conglomerate of column stills in Northern Ireland, they absorbed the stocks, and there's the question, this to them was just stocks of grain whiskey, and it's fit to be blended into Hague, and probably was put right back into the system. And legislation is what has stopped that from occurring. Now, these kinds of arbitrary, well, that would cease to be Scotch the minute somebody found out you put a drop of Irish grain whiskey, even though the grain whiskey was probably almost nearly identical. These kind of divisions have emerged, and it's funny because again that that blended infrastructure that Scotch has that allows people to kind of push capacity. If I was to pinpoint one, there's a lot of sob story reasons about what happened to Irish distilling in the early 20th century, why it collapsed. You know, it was a kind of a perfect storm of circumstances. But if you're going to pinpoint one, as a kind of a bow that goes right from the 1880s, right from Alfred Barnard's time, right to the 50s, it's this certain lack of cooperation between column distillers and pot distillers. So if you go to many visitor centres, they'll tell you the Irish rejected the column still. If you look at the maths, it's clearly not true. But again, it was a narrative pushed by certain pot still producers. There's Lloyd George said this was one more example of Dublin and Belfast just not getting on. You know, now he was a teetotaler and thought it was all just liquor. And he said, this is them quibbling. They can't. One likes the color pink, one likes the color purple. And but again, there was this refusal to create. And if you look at the 1908 trial, you see this kind of again certain caucuses of allies. So you had Colonel Grant from Glenlivet, who was refusing to blend, allied with Andrew Jameson. Ironically, Jameson is now the leading Irish blended whiskey, but the original Andrew Jameson was trying to basically criminalize the process. And so you have them on one side, and then you have some of the Belfast lads caucusing with DCL, and it becomes much more complicated. And it's these kinds of interests, and you can see the commonalities and the divergences. But what eventually happened in Scotland was the point was gotten across that the blenders were the clients of the malt producers rather than necessarily only the competitors. And that created this structure, for better or for worse. I'd argue historically for better. And in Ireland, even now, there is no, so who has the old stock? Middleton have old stock, Bushmills have old stock, and they don't have any interest in letting it past the distillery doors, There isn't the same kind of architecture, and you wonder, well, will it come in time? Certainly when places inevitably somebody will close down. It's just a fact of life. What will happen to all that stock? Will somebody else eat it up and so forth? Will something emerge? It's because it's so odd for us. I remember seeing an article that was about single blends, and it was very esoteric, and it was saying, well, what about Scottish distilleries that make both the grain and the pot still in-house? Is this a category? And I think, well, this is literally how Jameson is made.
Everything's always been tried. There's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah,
in whiskey making.
And again, so I think there's things to be learned from both. I think Ireland at the moment is a kind of a Wild West, where because there's an awful lot of young stock coming out. There's an awful lot of opportunists who have entered and who will give you the same line as other producers. But at the same time, there's a lot of creativity. There's a lot of reclamation, I think, certainly within, the idea of kind of, Ireland is a kind of a graveyard of its own lost distilleries. You look at Alfred Barnard, and it's funny, again, we were talking before about a whiskey distillery in Scotland wanting an asterisk and mentioning that they were in the book. But, Talisker and Clynelish and all of these, venerable old Scottish distilleries are all in there. And then you look at the Irish pages and they're all gone. Now, ironically, it's, the numbers have actually recently recalibrated. But, it's the Alfred Barnard Scotch section is a kind of a pedigree, whereas the Irish section is an obituary. And all these places are ruins and wrecks. And so, he goes up to, say, Cassidy's distillery in Kildare, and he talks about their double distilled mixed mash, and these strange, and he says, it is alike to the Dublin distillates in character, best bottled as a self whiskey, and all this. You think, well, again, Cassidy's closed so long ago, like 1920s, that we're scrambling after this kind of sense of what was lost. But similarly, there's that kind of sense of reclamation is carries a certain boldness and a certain adventurousness, as opposed to, well, we're protecting what we've got. And again, ironically, as we've talked about, almost, as an endemic trait of the industry, its sense of its own past is usually more to do with the present than with the past.
Yes. We see it. It's not as though Scotch whisky has remained in aspic. It's changed. We've seen the demise, basically, of the specialist blender. Yeah. People that would buy bulk have no production facilities themselves, and blend it and sell their own products from that. They've almost entirely disappeared. There's a few very small, and the ones that have remained have all had to buy primary production. Have to become distillers themselves. Have to become distillers, and that's to do with who will trade with whom. And because with the growth of Scotch whisky, there's been a dearth of Scotch, once again of aged stock, So companies have been unwilling to sell them on, and you see the demise of, say, supermarket brands, because why sell it to a supermarket to put their own label on it when we can put our label on it and cut out.
Right. I mean, the last chapter in that overall arc of the triumph of branding, and ultimately it is most important that our label be on our product. You know, that we claim this space as well as the just profits as dry numbers. We need to claim the visual space, you know, the branding space. And again, and it's funny we think about these as, you know, I mean, again, these branded labels are as a 20th century thing themselves. You know, you look at these, as you said before, that you get the kind of specialist blenders, and before that you look at distilleries that are more or less, I don't want to say factories, but they are producers of a thing, you know. But the idea of going into a shop and seeing an Oban bottled as such by the distillery, you know, is so recent. You know, these histories are much younger than the histories of, say, Oban Distillery or whatever distilleries, you know. I mean, you might see a label that some bonder has done where they tell you where they got it, but again, you know, there is that long, and that runs across both, you know. And I think in Ireland we have a certain rise now, and I know it's true in Scotland, but it seems to be particularly, you know, endemic at the moment in Ireland of revived brands, and you know, some of them are quite sincere, and some of them are a bit more twee, but you know, there is this idea of like grabbing at the past. And you wonder, you know, well, let's say these places are long gone, you know. And as you were talking about, like the proprietors' names have survived the proprietors. You know, Haig is no longer the Haig family. You know.
Well, if you look at old archives, you know, we're talking about the DCL archive. You see lots of old names there, and the kind of almost a folk memory of them. You know, so Haig, I suppose, white and black, and you know, White Horse and other. They might exist in export markets still, but they don't exist, and that's really a result of companies merging together. And there's no point having a stable of a dozen whiskey brands because they're just competing against each other. They're not really competing.
I think there's like, I'd be cautious about when I see brands trying to. Like if you want to try and resurrect a specific, as we've tried to do, specific styles of whiskey or brands, and there can be a degree of legitimacy or something that can be attained by buying an old brand, or in the case of Scotland, carrying on with a brand that has been around for 100 years, but to hinge or hang your whole, I suppose, existence on this thing that this has a reputation for what it was in the past, would cause me concern. If in Ireland, our biggest strength, our biggest opportunity in Ireland is the amount of passion and innovation that is happening, whether it's in the mash bill element, whether it's in the maturation element, or distillation, or a combination of all of the above. The biggest potential I think we have to close the gap on Scotland is that Scotland appears to be more dogmatic because of its success, because of how well what they are doing at the moment has served them. But if there's any lessons really from Ireland's past, is to believe that we're too big to fail because we're so successful. That's exactly what happened to Ireland. There were some external pressures, there was a reluctance to change, nothing could stop us, and then political pressures from independence from Britain, and not massively dissimilar to what could potentially happen with Brexit, and political pressures and difficulties in trade causing with that. And then just a stagnation in creativity, because what we do is better. That's what happened in Ireland. We were creating an exceptional product, but the reluctance to then evolve with the industry and move to blends and produce blends meant that, because Scotland were willing to do that, they raced away from us. And that is that is a potential. That's I suppose, wearing my Irish whiskey hat, that is something exciting that we could to start to grow and become in a very exciting category because of our desire to be innovative and create great products. But wearing my fans of whiskey in general hat, I would hope, and I've certainly been, and even from my conversations in Scotland this week, I'm certainly, I don't know that this is a big threat, because there seems to be a lot of innovation, and there seems to be, obviously there's no shortage of passion in Scotland, but the same threats, history has a habit of repeating yourself if you don't learn from it. So
it's always very dangerous to predict the future, because it's always wrong. But only sure thing about a prediction is it's going to be wrong. But the history of whiskey production, both in Ireland and in Scotland, has been one of boom and bust. And the busts, because we're now so big, are yes, some of the more financially insecure companies disappear or get taken over and amalgamated, and the majors become larger. And it's almost inevitable because of the lag there is between the making and the selling of it, because of and as maturation periods get longer, those booms and busts get.
Absolutely. I mean, nothing is immortal, and yeah, it is. Again, Ireland is it's such a warning story when you look at the What Is Whiskey trial, an enormously successful heritage industry that again, it's not one unified thing, but there was an enormous resistance to adapt, and blending was a big part of that. Even just branding in general, Scotland really, via the Scotch blenders, via the Tommy Dewars of the world, marched forward with brand consistency. We've come back after the fact and romanticized single malt whiskey, but the world was conquered by big blended brands. And Ireland, even like 50 years later, there was this really ghastly prospect of, there was a senator, Jack McQuillan, who suggested nationalising the Irish whiskey industry. He said these pot still purists are such, old grumps that, and he said, the Scots have swept the deck with their blended products while these men live in cloud cuckoo land. and again, this is just absolutely, even as the world was collapsing around them, they had very definite ideas about what Irish whiskey was. It was pot distilled, it was mixed mash. They even actually, in the early days of the Free State, there was actually a 5-year minimum for Irish whiskey. They lowered it down in the late 60s to compete. But they would create new barriers to entry to keep other people from getting into Irish whiskey, or to compete with, they felt so threatened by everything around them. And that's, again, a dire warning. The Irish whiskey industry today looks nothing like those people, and similarly we get this kind of Wild West, but there is that sense of reclamation, and certainly for me, like, I don't get a lot of joy out of seeing some random Victorian brand on a supermarket shelf turn into a blend, a value blend, and say, telling me about how they're reviving it. But I do have an enormous love for the material culture. If someone says, well, I've found this, again, procedural process from Cassidy's, and mash bill's the most obvious form of that, and it doesn't matter what they label it, but that's a kind of a much more, for me, kind of culinary birthright that everyone can pull from that material history of making the drink itself. And I have a lot of love for the revival of that, and I think that has gained a lot of traction in Ireland. The Irish whiskey GI is being revised at the moment, and there's a lot of tectonic plates being shifted, and it was a kind of a moment to get right, because once it's set in stone, as Scotland knows, it's very hard to shake.
We do forget the Scotch whisky definition. It does get changed from time to time, and there was quite a major change, particularly on labelling regulations. Just a few years ago, so it does change.
And the expansion of tequila casks and various casks.
Yes, different casks, and became what cask you could use became much more defined than it was before. So that put some clarity on where there was a bit of confusion about what is maturation in terms of flavour generation. You can't. It's got to be a natural flavour. It's still got to have the flavour of the raw materials and the wood that it's and the oak that it's matured in. We don't see great new products coming onto the market. We see that from the new distilleries, but I mean, the volume is very, very, very small. The major is much more keen on product extension. So if you go to, Macallan, probably the leading malt, the number of product extensions that they've got is labelled Macallan and branded as Macallan, but it's huge, right. Huge. I can't even tell you how many there are, but it's certainly in the hundreds. Different expressions of Macallan. But they all under that aegis of Macallan, and have a similarity because they're single malts, or as well as used in blends as well. So that's really where our innovation has been in terms of branding, has been brand extension, and you see. You see more and more bottles appearing as different ages, different expressions. And if you have 1 million or so casks in your inventory, you can do that. Yeah. You can draw on that. You can play tunes on that. And it always makes me laugh because there's always a new product extension coming out. It's always a parcel of casks that have been found mysteriously in the warehouse by the master blender. Well, of course, everybody knows what's in the warehouse because it has to be customs excise insists.
They're all if there
recorded,
was genuinely
they're all
bar-coded
in
the warehouse, there'd be a very real problem.
But it's a bit of mythology, a bit of codology, which is the trope that's brought out from time to time.
Oh, absolutely. It's great they get away with this stuff. Like, one day we discovered a cask under the floorboards, we're going to say this publicly because revenue would have no problem with this whatsoever. And we brushed it off, and Indiana Jones style, the light shone out of the cask.
Friends in marketing are always very creative.
Yeah.